I wrote this book. They said there was a white person that wrote this book and they just put my face on the cover. Well, it was me who wrote the book, but it was white people who was pushing the book. And as a matter of fact, 5,000 copies of these books were sold. And not only that, not only 5,000, but would you believe, 5 different languages this book was sold into. And not only that, Mr. Garrison, he came to me one day, one Saturday morning when I was at home with my family, and he burst through the door and he said, Frederick, you got to leave the country. What do you mean? You got to leave the country. In your book, you told about your slave masters and everything. They're going to come get you. But I can't leave. And my beautiful Anna sitting there with little Annie. She said, Frederick, you go on now, because we need you alive, not dead. So believe it or not, I packed up and I went on to Ireland. And I stayed in Ireland for 2 years. And in the midst of staying there, I spoke everywhere. As a matter of fact, I met a beautiful young lady by the name of Miss Richardson. Miss Richardson and her crew came to me one day while we was at a social gathering. And I'm standing there with a little drink in my hand. And she comes up and she says, Frederick. And I said, yes. How are you? Well, Frederick, we have some news for you. Okay. We just sent $750 to your master. You're free. I turned away and I looked. And I drank. Free. And then she said, Frederick, what you can do, you can call back for your family and you can bring them here and you can live here for the rest of your life. And don't have to worry about anything. And I thought about that. It sure sounded good. But then I told her, I said, Miss Richardson, I thank you very much. But I must go back to America. There's more of my brothers and sisters that are in bondage and they need me. So I thank you very much. Well, I have you know, not only did I come back to America for that, just to come back for that reason, but I also found out my baby girl Annie had died. So she was only 10 years old. So I snuck back into the States, even though I was a what? Free man. And when I got back in the States, I started heating up, and by this time we were living in Rochester, New York. And I started what was called the Frederick Douglass Weekly newspaper. I also had what was also called the North Star newspaper, and various other names I gave my newspaper. Mr. William Lloyd Garrison, him and I, we began to ruffle each other's feathers, if I could say that, because of the fact of the Constitution. Mr. Garrison believed that the Constitution was a knock against slavery. I believe, even though it was a knock against slavery, that I could use that Constitution to free blacks out of slavery. So we began to riff and tear apart, and he began to use his liberator to downgrade me and say things about me and my family. Well, moving on just for the sake of time, there was an election coming up. There were 3 gentlemen that are vying to become president of these United States. You had Mr. Douglass, not me. You had Mr. Richardson. And you also had a gentleman by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican, and please understand that once Mr. Lincoln got in the race, that was when the Republican Party was born. The Democratic Party had been around years before the Republican Party, so the Republican Party basically started with Mr. Lincoln. I listened to all 3 of the candidates. Mr. Douglas, quite naturally, because he's wearing my name, I really had to take an interest in what his platform was about. But when it came to his saying that it really didn't matter, slave or no slave, it didn't matter, I kind of turned away from him. Mr. Richardson, he wasn't even on point. And Mr. Lincoln, he had the view that we would bring slavery to an end, but it's just a matter of time. And he was seeing maybe 100 years. So you imagine, 100 years from 1860 would have put us at 1960. So that means that, if you will, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke in Washington amongst 280,000 people on August the 28th, 1963. As a matter of fact, my great-grandmother was in the audience. That would have been, if I'm not mistaken, help me out with my math, 52, 53 years? 57 years ago, meaning that blacks in this country would have just been freed. Think about that. So if you go back to 100 years, 1860 if you will, I had the opportunity to go to the White House. And what an experience it was. Being the first black man to enter into the White House. Now, quite naturally, being black, they wanted me to go through the what? Back door. But I went up to the front door. Unlike today, you would get nowhere near that White House today. But back in the days, you could just walk up to the door. I got cookies, selling cookies. You couldn't do that today. So when I got up to the door, they opened up the door and, can I help you? I'm here to see Mr. Lincoln. You need to go to the back door. So somehow, I managed to get in. And I went to the office, Oval Office, where Mr. Lincoln was sitting at. If you don't know, allow me to tell you that Mr. Lincoln stood 6 feet 4 inches. If you don't know, allow me to tell you that I stood 6 feet 2 inches. So when I went in and I shook Mr. Lincoln's hand, I just looked up because he was tall. And he said, have a seat, Mr. Douglas. Such as. He sat behind the big desk in the Oval Office, and I sat before that desk. And I crossed my legs, such as, very professional, putting my fingers here. And I said, Mr. Lincoln, it's a pleasure to meet you. He cut me off. And he said, Mr. Douglas, I've heard all about you. I've heard everything you said about me. But that's okay. How can I help you today? And I began to get into my quest. Well, Mr. Lincoln, I come today for 3 reasons. I come, sir, because I'm interested in how blacks in this country can be free. And by this time, the Civil War was going on, and I want to find out, sir, how can we talk about black men taking part on an even scale in this Civil War, meaning that equal pay, equal health care, and the opportunity to sleep in proper quarters. And lastly, sir, I come to speak about women's rights, the freedom of women as well in this country. So we're talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. At that time, Mr. Lincoln gets up, and he goes to the window, and he opens the shade, and he looks out, and he turns around, and he says, Mr. Douglas, I thank you very much for coming today, but I think that's going to take time, sir. I think we're rushing too far ahead. But I agree with you. Some of these things need to come to an end. Now, like I said before, Mr. Lincoln, he wanted slavery to end, but what you may not know is that he also wanted slavery to continue because he owned slaves as well, in case you didn't know this. So, after our conversation, I shook his hand, he shook my hand, and I said, thank you, sir, and he said, thank you, Mr. Douglas. So I left. As I got outside the fence, I looked at the White House, poked my chest out, and I said, wow, I really feel big. I've been in the White House. As you know, I was the first black man to enter into the White House. From there, I made my way back up to Rochester, New York, to my home, and unfortunately, someone came along and they bombed my home. Thankfully for my son, Lewis, who saved all of my writings, though we lost everything. I was also asked to come speak in I'm going back a little bit, 1852. It was the 4th of July. Would you all like for me to share the speech with you? Okay, thank you. Sir, I got to tell you something. I love all of y'all. Thank you for coming this morning. And I know how we use the word love nowadays, but I sincerely love you all. Thank you. The meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro. Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, he who could address this audience without a squandering sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember to have appeared as a speaker before the assembly more shrinkingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me, quite unfavorably to the exercise of my limited powers of speech. Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon here to speak? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of national justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offerings to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, for both, for your sake and ours, that affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burdens easy and delightful? But such is not the case. I say, with a sad case of disparity between us, I am not included in the pale of your glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. At this time, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ears, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, weathering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle showers, but thunder. We need the storms, the whirlwinds, and the earthquake. The feelings of this nation must be quickened. The prosperity of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and they are heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted prudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and your thanksgivings, with all your religious parades and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impurity, and hypocrisy. The thin veil to cover up his crimes, which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on this earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, search out all the monarchies and dispositions of the old world. Travel through South America, search out every abuse. And when you have the found the last. Lay your facts by the side of your everyday practices of this nation. And you will say with me that for revolting barbarity, shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. Thank you. And I have you know, some of the people in the audience, sure, they were upset. Who are you? But the majority of them were clapping. And some even came up to me and said, Mr. Douglas, thank you very much. We really needed to hear that. Well, as time moves on, just for the sake of time, I got a call. Let's say it's about 1864. I got a call from the White House. Even though I got that call, let me dial back a little bit. I went back, like I said, I went back to Rochester, New York from the White House. We were waiting on a moment. We were all standing out in the cold, waiting on that one moment in our lifetime. The moon had came out and the sun and the stars were shining so bright. And we were all mingling together. And all of a sudden, the Pony Express came. And they dropped off the notice that President Abraham Lincoln had just signed the Emancipation Proclamation, indicating that blacks in this country were forever free. January 1, 1863. And yes, we had a good time. Yes, we shout, we scream. Yes, and even though we didn't do it back then, but I'm going to do it now just for the sake of where we are today, we gave each other high fives. And we dabbed each other. We might even did a little bit of the flaws. But 1864, I got a summons from the White House. It was President Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, which I didn't mention, he wanted to continue the fight that one gentleman had begun. And that one gentleman allowed me to say his name, John Brown. John Brown stayed in my house for 3 days, 3 weeks. And I allowed Mr. Brown, I said, Mr. Brown, you can stay in my house for 3 weeks for free. He said, no, Frederick, I cannot do that to you. He said, you must charge me. So I charged him $3 a week. And his plan was to take over Harper's Valley. And he worked on that plan constantly, so much that when I would bring distinguished guests over to speak to meet him, the only thing he would baffle out his mouth, how he was going to destroy Harper's Valley. I was kind of envious of him, and yeah, I will admit, I was jealous of him. I was jealous of him because he was a white man that was fighting for the cause of slaves and freeing them. And even though I was free, I felt because of him, I should have been doing more. So he pulled me to the side. He said, Frederick, I would really love if you come and go with me. But I knew, just as much as my heart wanted me to go, I knew my heart was split that I couldn't go. Because if I would have went, I would have been the first one dead. I had that feeling. And as a matter of fact, his man that he had with him, Shields Green, who was a black man, who was free because of John Brown. I called Shields to the side and I said, Shields, please, talk him out of doing this. You're walking into a trap. And all Shields could say was, Mr. Douglas, thank you, sir, but I must go with the old man. They left my home, headed for Harper's Valley. And yes, they killed a lot of slave owners, but they got killed too. And they sent Mr. John Brown to the gallows. And back then, it wasn't like you went to jail such as now and you go to it, even if they still do it, the lecture chair. They would have hangings in the center court, if you will, like downtown. And that's where they hung John Brown. John Brown he became a hero to many of blacks in the South and the North because of his fight for freedom for us. Well, Mr. Lincoln, he didn't mention it to me, but I kind of figured that's what he wanted to be on that plane to help blacks. And what he wanted me to do, he wanted me to go out west and to summons all the blacks that are still under the reign of slavery, that slavery was over. He also wanted me to be able to take them and move them to safe grounds. Mr. Lincoln saw something that I didn't see. He saw something that many of us didn't see. And even at his second inauguration, after his second election, and I'm sitting out in the audience, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, Mr. Lincoln, with Johnson sitting next to him, and he said, "Oh, there go my friend Frederick Douglass." Before he said that, Mr. Johnson had a smile on his face. As soon as he said, my friend Frederick Douglass, his smile went from, So I said right then, I can't trust that man. He's not for us blacks in this country. In case you don't know, April the 14th, I believe it was, correct the date if you will, 1865. Mr. Lincoln and his beautiful wife was at the theater looking at a play. And while Mr. Lincoln was sitting there enjoying the play, not knowing what was coming up behind him, John Wilkes Booth, who incidentally at the same time was supposed to be down on stage in the play because he was an actor. But he's standing behind Mr. Lincoln and he shoots Mr. Lincoln in the head. It was April the 15th. They buried Mr. Lincoln. And sometimes later, I think it was 1866, they donated a park, Memorial Park, Lincoln Memorial Park, which still stands in Washington, D.C. today. And they had a gathering. I was in the audience. There was a lawyer up on stage speaking, and they were booing him. And somebody just happened to turn around and say, "There's Frederick Douglass!" And I went up on stage and I spoke. And I told the truth about Mr. Lincoln. I said that Mr. Lincoln, he was a white man's president. We blacks, we were like his adopted children. We were his foster children. But however, in the midst of that, we cannot discount the fact that Mr. Lincoln moved forward and he freed his adopted children so that we could stand on the same plane as his white children. So we should forever hold it to Mr. Lincoln that if it wasn't for Mr. Lincoln, we would not be free. And at the conclusion of my speech, as I walked down the stairwell, his wife, Mary Lincoln, came up to me. She hugged me. And after she hugged me, she gave me Mr. Lincoln's walking stick. And if you visit my home today in Anacostia, Cedar Hill, you will see the walking stick. And by the way, there are some pictures here. If you've never been to his home, there's some pictures here with his home, pictures that I took while I visited his home in 2012. I always get the question is, because on this blue board back there, at the bottom, the right picture at the bottom there, a lot of folks ask me, "What were you doing there, Mr. Dowridge?" Well, believe it or not, and I know I'm jumping ahead, but that's where Mr. Douglass had a heart attack, at the bottom of the stairwell there. So I asked the tour guide, could I enact that so people could know how Mr. Douglass died. So anyway, as time went on, I began to hold offices. My first office that I held, I became the president of the Freedom National Bank. I was the first black to hold that office. And then there was talk going around in the black community that I was a sellout, that I cared no more about the fight for freedom and my people because I began to hold offices. Well, I have you know, no, I was not a sellout. But I will say, if it wasn't for that first office that I held, a lot of offices that blacks hold today, they would not held. I went from being the president of the Savings National Bank to Marshal of Washington, D.C., and I'll let you know that I moved my family from Rochester, New York to Washington, D.C. After moving to Washington, D.C., after 40 years of a beautiful marriage, my wife, Anna Mary, died. It took a lot out of me when she passed away. And I will give credit to likes of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman and I became good friends. And as a matter of fact, I'm sure you all know the history of Harriet Tubman. She was the founder of the Underground Railroad. And I began to, believe it or not, open my home at Cedar Hill as sort of like a stop on the way for the slaves to stop. I fed them. As a matter of fact, my daughter, Rosetta, who was the oldest, she was there with me. And my son, Lewis Douglas, after serving in the military with the 54th Regiment, Lewis and Frederick Jr., they served in the military. They were there to help me with this mission of helping to free slaves. So I went on to become the Order of Deeds. I took a commission in Haiti. I served there for 2 years. But once I found out that there was something going on that I didn't like, I gave up that commission. I don't know if anyone out here ever heard of a gentleman by the name of Ulysses S. Grant. Well, believe it or not, I campaigned day and night for Mr. Grant to become President of these United States, which he did. And while he was President of the United States, I have you know that he put into act the Klan Act, that is the Ku Klux Klan Act. And with that being a law, 5,000 Klans were killed or either arrested. We put the Klan out of business. And it was written that Mr. Grant, besides Abraham Lincoln, was the best president there ever was to help the cause of the blacks in this country. Well, from there, on Cedar Hill, as I said, my wife died. I was 66 when I remarried. I remarried a young lady who was 20 years younger than me, so that makes her 46. She was my secretary. And she worked in my office. As a matter of fact, her father, Gillian Pitts, him and I, we used to go on speaking engagements together in the anti-slavery lectures. The secretary, as I said, Miss Helen Pitts, she was white. And we married. And as you know, that my daughter Rosetta and my sons, they were terribly upset at that. Miss Pitts' family disowned her, had nothing else to do with her. But in the winding years of my life, Miss Helen Pitts and I, we traveled the globe. And even though I was still in the midst of fighting for the freedom of blacks and women in this country, Miss Pitts and I, we took time. And upon my return back to the States and back to the speaking engagements, and I was in my 70s at this time, with a cane, Abraham Lincoln's cane, I was commissioned to speak again. And the question is, anybody ever heard of Susan B. Anthony? Anybody out here have any Susan B. Anthony coins? I have about 10 of them. Even though they're out of commission, I still have 10. So anyway, I was off to my speaking engagement in Washington, in a carriage, which I was helped into. And when I got to the convention center, I was helped out of the courage. And standing there to receive me was no other than yours truly, Susan B. Anthony. We walked inside and we talked inside, and we sat on a podium together until it was my turn to speak. I was a big component of women's suffrage. I strongly, I'll say it again, I strongly believed in women's rights. And I didn't care what color you were. I didn't care your religion, your gender, whatever. You're a woman, I believe, just like blacks, I believe you deserve the freedom. And when I left that podium after my speech in a standing ovation, Miss Susan B. Anthony helped me to my courage. When I got home, my wife Helen Pitts was in the kitchen entertaining guests. And she said, "Frederick, are you hungry?" I said, "No, but I do have another engagement." So she said, "Well, go take a break for a minute." So as I began to go upstairs to head to the bedroom to rest for a second, that's when I felt the pain in my chest. And I went down. I was deceased February the 20th, 1895, at the age of 77. And I have you know that after my death, I laid in state. Anyone know what lay in state mean? In other words, they had my casket with me in it laying in the Capitol Rotunda for a week. And believe it or not, there were dignitaries, princes, kings, queens that came from all over the globe to say goodbye to me. I am currently buried in Rochester, New York, next to my beautiful wife, Anna, and yes, Helen Pitts. As I conclude, allow me to leave you with this. Agitate, agitate, agitate. And please, read, read, read. Young people, take advantage of your education. The world is yours, but education will open all the doors you need. Thank you.